Welcome to the Fantasy Football Lab.
Let's talk about the history of fantasy football.
These
All
drops, man. I just want to say these drops are dope.
Thank you, man. Thank you. Well, let's put it to the speed of 88. Go back in time, and go back all the way to the 1950s. That's where the story begins. So I had such a fun time digging into fantasy football history and just learning a little bit about it. So I kind of teased this last time we spoke, and it was the fact that like we actually owe quite a bit of fantasy football to fantasy golf, which I don't know if it's a thing or not still. So I should have probably looked that up. I don't know if people do fantasy golf, but this guy named Bill, they called him Bill Winkenbach. He was a partial owner of the Oakland Raiders, and he wanted to kind of figure out some, and at the time it wasn't called fantasy. It was just, but we'll refer to it fantasy football, fantasy golf throughout this, but the term fantasy didn't actually come until like the I think the 80s. And in the 1950s, he started an experiment with golf, and he had fantasy golf where he really wanted to kind of understand how he was playing around with how do we take these real but fictional players and their stats in real life and mix it in so that there's a game that we can play together. So we'll take a look at that. We'll also take a look at like how that transitioned into fantasy football itself, talking about the first league and giving them their dues and credit throughout this conversation. And then we'll move into also this like throughout the series we'll move into all these different pieces, how it became this like multi-billion-dollar industry. But along the way, the first piece, I definitely want to give credit to the first champions, talk about how it was structured, what was the scoring system like in the beginning. And that's gonna be most of the talk today, of just like how was it done in the beginning and why did it start. So Bill Winkenbach, the godfather, I think is fair. Again, part owner of the Oakland Raiders, and he was a really big sports fan. So he looked at fantasy golf because at the time it was pretty easy to just kind of choose a golfer, and the stats were kind of out there, strokes, like par, you have birdie, like extra points for that, and you can do that and you can create this like this piece here. But the problem with golf versus other sports like football is it just wasn't as widespread, and it wasn't as consistent. It wasn't like this Sunday, every Sunday you're gonna have a game. And that I think that's what the problem with it was at first. But when I first heard that it was fantasy golf that it started with, it's got to be one of my least favorite sport. It makes so much sense, obviously, but I was just like,
Yeah, because
golf,
the numbers
really?
are a lot more understandable and like,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, but I get how it works. So he did that in like 58, 59, and he messed around with it for like, I don't know, a few years, and then in 63, which is like about the time when the AFL was starting to pop off, NFL was starting to pop off too, and they were like looking at a possible merger. These were two real leagues. They decided to try fantasy football. And at this time it was kind of funny because they really focused on NFL teams. And if you are a fan of the Raiders, you know that originally they were an AFL team. So there's like a mixed history. There's a mix, like a lot of these facts I found are very much like not fully word of mouth, but it's not like completely confirmed on the early years how it ran. The assumption is that there was at least Raiders players, but a lot of people talked about it was NFL only, even though it was started by a Raiders owner. And I think though that the main assumption is that at least Raiders were in there, and that's how they started it. And that it made sense to do because you're looking at weekly games. It was like a good transition from golf to something that had a little more consistency.
Yeah. One of my favorite things to look up, and sorry, I cheated a little bit. I looked up a little bit of history here.
Please.
Your boy Bill, the minority Raiders owner, started this whole thing because, like, he made this transition because it was in 1962. They were coming into a season where they were 0-13, and Raiders
Yeah.
fans were really restless.
Yeah.
So they wanted to try to figure out a way to make football watchable.
Yeah.
And I love that for the Raiders as a Chargers fan. I just want to call it out.
No, I think it's a good call out. It was like, because that's how I'm a Browns fan. So that's like at the time when fantasy football started, the Browns were it. They were the golden boys of the leagues. You know, they were dominant force. But I feel as when I started fantasy football, I wanted to look at a way to root for a football team I loved that did really well. And it was my own fantasy football team. It was like, how can we have fun with this sport that we suck at? And I feel like there's a connection there. My first league, in which the trophy stands behind me, started in the same city as this one. It started in Oakland. The first ever league was in Oakland. It was called the, get ready for this long name, it was the Greater Oakland Professional Pigskin Prognosticators League, or for short, GOPPPL. The Greater Oakland Professional Pigskin Prognosticators League.
It's one of those acronyms where I'd rather just not have the acronym.
Right,
The
right.
GOPPL.
I mean, I think you could say Gopple. I'm going to say Gopple, right? I think that's fair.
I'll take your word for it. The Gop. Oh.
The Gopple Gopple. All right, so as they transitioned, golf it wasn't as broad. It wasn't, so they transitioned to football. They get in here, and Wickenbach, he decides to start this. He's a part owner of the Oakland Raiders. The NFL and AFL, they were growing in popularity. So it was a time when it was more common to have this conversation at bars. It was more common to have this conversation about football in general with friends. So there was also the movement, and you'll see throughout the history of football, it was like this the evolution of stats being recorded were a big part of how fantasy football could evolve and could work. And the first way that we had it for fantasy football was, it was really touchdown only, and there were no matchups. So talking about like the formation of the first leagues, it was an 8-team league, and this goes back to like, let's think about starting another league. But it's like the Gopple League, the GOPPPL League. We can start, and this is how it would run. You would have 2 quarterbacks, 4. This is how old it is. Laugh with me. 4 halfbacks, 2 fullbacks, and this is the full roster that they allowed, and then including bench, and then no one's quite sure what the actual starting lineup was, but 2 quarterbacks, 4 halfbacks, 2 fullbacks, 4 ends. So ends are a wide receiver or tight end.
Gotcha.
So a mix of each. It's like a wide receiver, tight end flex. 2 return specialists, 2 place kickers, 2 defensive backs or linebackers flex, 2 defensive linemen. And all that counted was touchdowns. And there were no matchups, to keep it simple in the beginning. They just had kind of like our playoff, like when we just did no matchups in the playoff league, right? And it was whoever at the end of the playoffs had the most points won. There was no matchups.
No.
So this was the whole season.
Place kickers on the roster, wouldn't field goals have counted?
Yeah, that's the one difference. So it wasn't like, so it counted for a touchdown, a passing or rushing, receiving, any kind of touchdown. But it's the same for passing and rushing and receiving. And it's 25 points. I don't know why it's 25 points, but it's 25 points. Defensive or special teams touchdowns, here's where it changes. It's 25 points.
I'm glad they worked that out.
Yeah. Field goals actually match football. It's 3 points, and it's 1 point for an extra point.
Huh, that's interesting.
So we have 25, and that's all the scoring. That's the whole thing. 25 points, field goal, extra point, 3-1. There's no yardage at all. They only cared about the touchdowns. There was a question, because I know that there's defensive players. There's not information on the scoring for defensive players. I couldn't find
Right.
anything. There's nothing definitive, and so there's an assumption that there were turnover points, and very, very early there was probably house rules for different defensive points, but the thought is that it might actually just be that there was defensive players just in case they got a touchdown, and then maybe turnover is a couple points, but they're not quite sure about that. But they were there; they were part of the roster.
Well, when we create the league, we can come up with our own.
Yeah.
System for them.
When do we do? I like this. Yeah. So the champion was whoever just amassed the most points by the end of the season. It was simple. You draft your thing. There wasn't I don't even think in the first few years they even did like a waiver wire trade situation. It was almost like not a best ball, because you set your lineup, and the way they set their lineup in the beginning is that they would call the commissioner by Friday night. You have to call the commissioner and read off to him what your lineup is. He would write it in, and then on Monday, his secretary would total up all of the points and a lot of it had to be listened to because some teams didn't report as strongly as, so a lot of them were listened to, and then Monday they would total it up, and Tuesday you would get a phone call from the commissioner saying how many points you got that week, which is like easier to deal with when it's not a matchup anyways. So it's not like, did I win or lose this, but like, how many points did I get this week? And you just throw out who you can, and you listen to the games that you can, and then the commissioner confirms.
Imagine what that looked like back then, man. Like the commitment. We can't get people to set their lineups on a weekly basis.
You gotta call in.
Like, imagine that's our goal today. Like you're looking at the teams in our league, and someone didn't set their lineup. We're literally calling.
Totally.
Set their lineup for them.
Yeah. So the highlight so far is 1963 is the golden year. That's when it started in Oakland, California. And it was started as an 8-team league, NFL players, maybe some AFL players. But just to kind of review of like the NFL teams. So we had, at the time, we had NFL teams were in the East, we had the Browns, the Cowboys, the Giants. We had Steelers, Eagles, St. Louis Cardinals. We had the Redskins. And then on the West, we had Baltimore Colts, Chicago Bears, Detroit Lions, Green Bay, Packers, the Rams, which had just moved from Cleveland, but at that point, the Los Angeles Rams, Minnesota Vikings, San Francisco 49ers. The AFL teams that possibly were part of it, so I'll mention it, but we had the Boston Patriots, the Buffalo Bills, Houston Oilers, New York Jets, that became the Titans of New York, and then we had the Denver Broncos, Kansas City Chiefs, which I didn't even realize were that old before doing this, and they were the Dallas Texans at that time, Oakland Raiders, and San Diego Chargers, which I wish were still the San Diego Chargers.
San Diego Superchargers.
Ooh, yep. Mufasa.
Right back then. Yeah, and that would have been like a year after, because they were 1961, I think.
Were they? That's when
Angels. I could be mixing that up with my Angels, but I think it's 61.
Are you going to fact check yourself here?
I am fact checking myself.
Good. All right, so likely the rosters were probably, honestly, just one per position is how I would probably play it. We've quarterback, halfback. You would probably have 2 running backs at that point, 1 wide receiver, tight end. But yeah, it being so touchdown heavy makes it like a simpler, I think, throughout the year, and no matchup makes it easier a little bit throughout the year. The manual stat tracking, like when I was listening to it, it's just I assumed that. I obviously there's no like that really came about in the news when there were some actual platforms that were starting to support this, along with like the rise of the internet itself, as like zooming or shooting forward here, it was like that's when it became easier to manage a league. Before that, it was so manual to make sure you're in a league. So it had to be these like hobbyists, like it was like the sports D&D of the world was fantasy
so crazy.
football.
Yeah. So that's really like similar to. So in the late '90s, my uncle started a league with a bunch of his like his brothers, his cousins. We're Filipinos, we have a huge family. So all these folks, and in the '90s, their stats were all from the paper. They just got the newspaper. What were the points or whatever? But the commissioner, one of my uncles, the way that they did it versus calling everybody, because it was all local, to make sure everything was on the up and up, he would drive to each of the person's houses on Monday, review the stats with them, and show them like what it was, and give them.
That's a
give them
damn
their
good
scores.
commissioner.
Like, and so like that was, I mean, that league is.
He just
still-
wanted people to feel like good about it, so he like actually reviewed everything with them.
Yeah, he like would go with the newspaper to like go over like what their score was, how it came through. I don't know like how much they like needed him to do that, but I think it was just a part of his process until the internet here. But that league is still alive today, and it's got the funkiest scoring stuff going on with it because they came up with it on their own scoring system before there was anything established by ESPN.
Yeah.
So they just kept their funky scoring system all together.
Do you remember any of what it is?
So, a couple of the things that they do now, and I don't know if this was added later or because they're weird or if it was at the beginning, but like running backs don't score any points for yards until they score 100, until they get 100 yards. So very few running backs actually score yardage now because no one runs over 100.
And rushing is the only thing that counts.
Right. Well,
so or is it the running
touchdowns
backs?
up.
Yeah, but like if the running back has a receiving yard of 50 and then 60 rushing, they don't have any of the rushing yardage.
Correct.
It has to be all. Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So they only get the rushing yardage if it's over 100. But that was back. I'm sure that rule came about during the heyday of like bell cow backs. And I don't know if they've never like. I remember like Frank Gore being a big deal when they would talk about that rule. Like
he is infinite.
The ageless wonder, Frank Gore.
Yeah.
So there's like funky stuff like that, but I just imagine like driving around figuring out your score. And this league has been so elite and local, and one of the fun things about like what's come of fantasy football, because like they still run today, but it's super exclusive. I'm on the wait list for that league for like 10 years. Like I'm still not in my own uncle's league. Like
dang,
because of how.
What do they run it on now?
16-team league. I'm not sure. I forget. They meet every year. They do a big draft party. They do a huge after party. They have transaction fees for every trade and every waiver pickup. Everything has a transaction fee, and all of those transaction fees go to their draft party the next year. Like, and so
cool.
That's how they cater like all their food, and they bring in all their stuff. Like all of it comes from that.
I love. You know what? One of the things that looking back at like original leagues, these grandfather leagues, is one of the things that I really wish I had. I mean, you know how many leagues we run together, even, and then extra, right? And none of them are live. And I mean, part of it is my own fact that I'm a transplant from a different area, so a lot of people are in the same area in the leagues, but like I don't have one league that's like a local draft party league, so I've never actually experienced the draft party itself. That sounds like a lot of fun. Also, consider a co-manager if you get invited to that league and you want a co-manager. Just throwing my name in the ring there. I'll fly down. It sounds like a great party.
It's I've never even been to the party, but yeah, it's a great time. It's good food, and they eat well. Like it's super fun. And the cool thing though that we're talking about with this is like when you had to go through what some of these early leagues and back in the history of time had to go through to keep scores, and you had to want it, and that built such camaraderie that like those are lifelong friendships. Even if you started in those leagues with people that were just acquaintances, those become your lifelong
100%. I mean, like for example, like you and I don't know if we would have had the same I know we wouldn't have had the same connection, and like stayed in, like we were on the same team at work together. We started some leagues together. We ran a work league, and we're still friends now. And we owe it, I think, to fantasy football. And I think that especially the originals who are like doing this as like it's Apple in a garage, like it's Google out of a basement. And I'm gonna give a shout out back to the garage days of fantasy football, and I'll give a shout out to, his name is Andrew Musalimes. So it's going to either be Bill Winkenbach, so a Winkenbach, or a Musalimes. But like some fantasy football trophies, I don't know what leagues it's going to be, need to be named after one or both of these dudes. Because the founder of fantasy football, Bill Winkenbach, and the first champion ever of fantasy football is Andrew Musalimes. I looked it up. I was like, I wonder if he's still alive and if we could like interview him, give him a call, get some of these details that are missing here. And he sadly passed in 2019 of being an old guy and a champion for so many years. He was a champion for years and years and years. And you know what? Champions go hard. So R.I.P. Musalimes, but like shout out to him. He was the first ever winner of the GOPPPL League.
The
I thought it'd be
Goppel. I'm calling. We'll go with the Goppel.
The Goppel, yeah. He owned a restaurant in Oakland. He was one of the friends of Winkenbach, and the original league was kind of mixed with just some friends like him and some like sports writers were a big part of it, of like some just local sports writers of NFL and AFL, and yeah, and so some of them had like the early access to stats in the paper. Some of them were just like fans of football and wanted to try this weird thing out. And we have Andrew as the first one. So I don't know what one sounds better, but I feel like the Musalimas has to be, or the Moose for short, has to be the name of one of the trophies in one of our leagues to honor the first ever champion.
The Moose, yeah, I like it. I feel like we need to call something the Goppel at some point, but we'll figure that out too.
Yes.
Maybe that's
we do.
Maybe
I think that's the league. Champion. Oh, the Goppel. Yeah, maybe that's the trophy. We got to figure that out. The champion, maybe it is the championship round, as he made it to the Goppel. But there's three things we got to honor, and it's the Goppel, it's the Winkenbach, and the Moose, and those are ones we got to honor in some way. We got to figure it out because those are three legends. And a fourth legend in real football that was a legend in fantasy is Andrew relied heavily on one player. I don't know. I'll give you kind of a guess and see if you could. I don't know if you would guess it, but the first championship team had one player that really defined. And I saw your typing stance go in, so don't cheat. Yeah, if you're going to cheat, look up. Go up like top 20 or top 20 or top 10 most iconic players of the 1963 season. That's as much.
I'm going to tell you 100% that I'm not going to get this. My 60s football fandom is All
right, should I give you the first clue?
Sure.
He was on the Browns.
I'm going to fail miserably.
It's the only Browns player you would ever know.
No idea.
All right.
Is his last name Brown?
Yes.
Jim Brown?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, he actually got it. So
I didn't actually cheat on that. That's cool.
Nice. Well played. The first ever championship team, his first pick was Jim Brown. The rumor says. And the rumor is very light on this one, just for the record, but being a Browns fan, I'm just going to go ahead and give it the nod. I'm going to run with that. Yeah, I'm going to run with that. Considering I heard that like the loser chose a quarterback first once, and the winner chose a running back first, and I was like, that's classic fantasy football. Like, yeah, let's go with that so truth. True today. Less of a Browns fan move, but like I'm just as a fantasy football fan. But yeah, Jim Brown was on the first the title winning roster, and he just scored too many touchdowns to mess with it. Because remember, it was only touchdowns at that point. So
yeah,
I think that player was the only one that got close to the quarterbacks of the time of how many they scored, because I don't think they had much of an offense, or other than him, he just could just run through anybody.
Yeah, I mean, forward passing was obviously a thing at the time, but I think we're still pretty running back heavy anyway back then. So that makes sense.
Yeah, and if you look at like I feel like in sports wise, like zooming out to just sports in general at the time, baseball was the classic American game, and at this time, and it was starting to at that time even be overshadowed by football already, even though organized football wasn't that old, where it was like it started with college football, and that's where it started, where people, like back in the day when people actually were like just regularly dying on the field, it was like an intense sport, it was a warrior sport.
Right.
And then it moved into this like, let's regulate this thing, and then finally a football team came about in Canton, Ohio, and then this finally started stabilizing in the 50s and 60s to like a legitimate actual sport. And then baseball feels like it was like the taxi company of sports, where it was so popular. And you know how much I hate baseball. You know how much I hate baseball. But it was like the taxi company of sports, where they were, and I think that you're a baseball fan,
I'm a baseball fan.
and I think you still might agree with me. Let's see. When I say taxi company of sports, they just rested on their laurels, and they just thought like, oh, we got this. We're the top sport, and they didn't embrace things like this. They didn't actually embrace TV, like live TV, in the '60s. That's what really took the AFL and NFL and brought it to another level. And
Right.
baseball didn't embrace that right away. They
Yeah.
just thought, oh no, you should be here if you want to watch it, which was
Right.
just not forward thinking. But fantasy was another piece, where it was like football hadn't embraced fantasy football yet, but it wasn't until the 80s where anyone even started. Like 20 years after fantasy football was when the first fantasy baseball team, which was called a rotisserie league, because it
Yeah.
started in a rotisserie chicken place in New York City. And that's when that started, and then started influencing fantasy football itself too. But at
Yeah.
this time, like the only fantasy sport in the world was fantasy football through all of the 60s, and then all of the 70s as well.
That's nutty to think about because of how classic a sport baseball is. You would assume that it would have been first to the fantasy spectrum, but you're right, because like even in today's baseball world, they're usually the late adopters to everything, right? So most sports have tried to figure out ways to keep the generations shorter, like shorter attention span in play, right? More baseball,
Right.
like regularly, like the pitcher can go out for a sandwich between pitches and keep playing, right? Like
Right.
there's no
Yeah.
pacing in the game. So they finally started adopting it in the last 2 years, where they have like the pitch clock and everything that they've introduced recently. And your old heads, your traditionalists, are still fighting that.
Yeah. They don't like
It's
it. And
interesting.